That night, I thought I was watching my family shatter. I filmed my father holding another woman's hand under the candlelight and sent the video to my mother, convinced I was doing the right thing. By the next morning, that clip did not just ruin his reputation, it endangered a hidden witness and handed a loaded weapon straight to the man who had spent years plotting to steal absolutely everything we owned. My name is Violet Garcia. I am 31 years old, and my entire professional life revolves around anticipating disasters. As a data risk analyst at Alder Metrics Group, I spend my days sifting through anomalies, looking for the exact moment a secure system begins to fracture. I am trained to see the microscopic cracks before the dam breaks. Yet, on a crisp Tuesday evening in Denver, sitting in the opulent dining room of St. Clair House, I failed to see the collapse of my own life until the debris was already falling around me. Nolan and I had not shared a proper meal in almost 3 weeks. Between his late nights consulting and my endless quarterly audits, we had become passing ghosts in our own apartment. St. Clair House was supposed to be our reset button. The restaurant was a fortress of low amber lighting, heavy velvet drapery, and the muted clinking of crystal, a place where the outside world was not allowed to intrude. Nolan, my fiancé, sat across from me, swirling a dark Cabernet in his glass. He looked handsome, grounded, and entirely devoted. I remember feeling a profound sense of gratitude. We were finally slowing down, finally taking a breath, finally looking at the future we were building. When I looked at Nolan, I saw the foundation of something enduring, much like the marriage my parents had built. Daniel and Elena Garcia were the gold standard. In a world where relationships frayed at the slightest tension, my parents were a fortress of unwavering loyalty. They had spent over 3 decades together, weathering the brutal early years of building Cobalt Meridian Logistics from a 2-person operation into an industry titan. My father was a man of quiet, commanding integrity. He was the kind of husband who still opened doors for my mother, who remembered the exact shade of yellow she loved, and who never let a single day end without making sure she knew she was the center of his universe. Their marriage was not just intact, it was invincible. I grew up believing that true love was an unbreakable contract, signed in mutual respect and sealed with absolute transparency. They were my absolute certainty. I took a sip of my wine, letting the rich warmth settle in my chest, and let my gaze wander across the dining room. The layout of St. Clair House was designed for discretion, with high-backed leather booths and secluded alcoves hidden behind sheer curtains. It was in one of these dimly lit corners, far from the main floor, that the breath abruptly left my lungs. At first, I thought my mind was playing a cruel trick, projecting a familiar face onto a stranger. But the broad shoulders in the charcoal suit, the distinct silver threading through his dark hair, the familiar way he held his posture, it was undeniably him. It was my father. My heart performed a violent, erratic stutter. Daniel Garcia was supposed to be at a closed-door board meeting across town. He had told my mother he would not be home until well past midnight. Yet here he was, bathed in the soft glow of a table candle, sitting across from a woman who was decidedly not my mother. She was striking, dressed in a sleek, tailored emerald dress that whispered of quiet wealth and careful preparation. Her dark hair was swept back, and her posture was rigid, leaning into my father's space. The air between them was thick, charged with a heavy, secluded intimacy that made my stomach twist into a painful knot. This was not a chance encounter. This was not a business dinner. The atmosphere was far too clandestine, too deeply personal for any innocent explanation to survive. I sat frozen, the ambient noise of the restaurant dissolving into a muted, rushing hum in my ears. I watched my father lean in closer to this stranger. His voice, though inaudible over the distance, clearly carried a low, urgent cadence. Then, he did something that felt like a physical blow to my chest. He raised his right hand, the hand that bore his heavy gold signet ring, a family heirloom he never, ever took off, and slowly slid it from his finger. He placed the ring deliberately on the white linen tablecloth. After setting the ring down, he reached across the small distance and took the woman's hand. He held it firmly, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a gesture of profound, agonizing reassurance. It was a touch of shared secrets, a touch of deep emotional tethering. The woman whom I would later learn was named Tessa Holloway did not pull away. Instead, she reached into her clutch and withdrew a thick, cream-colored envelope, its flap heavily sealed. She slid it across the table toward my father, keeping her hand resting over his for an extra, lingering second. To anyone watching, to the daughter staring in horrified silence, it looked exactly like the desperate, secretive choreography of an illicit affair. It looked like a man securing the silence of a mistress, or perhaps trading promises in the dark. "Violet," Nolan's voice broke through my paralysis. "Are you all right? You look like you just saw a ghost." I could not speak. I could only point a trembling finger toward the shadowed alcove. Nolan turned his head, his eyes narrowing as he tracked my gaze. I waited for him to offer a rational explanation, to laugh it off, to tell me my father was just finalizing a bizarrely intimate corporate acquisition. Instead, Nolan went completely still. He watched the scene unfold for several long, torturous seconds. When he finally looked back at me, his expression was a mask of grim realization. "He told your mother he was at the executive center," Nolan said, his voice low and carefully measured. "He did not call anyone at the house. If this were business, he would not be tucked away in a private booth at St. Clair taking off his jewelry." Nolan paused, letting the devastating logic sink in. "Violet, he is definitely hiding something. You know what this looks like." His words were perfectly reasoned, perfectly logical, and they acted as the final strike of a match dropped onto dry kindling. The denial I had been desperately trying to build instantly burned to ash. A raw, acidic betrayal surged up my throat. The man I had idolized my entire life was sitting 50 feet away, dismantling my family's foundation piece by piece, touch by touch. Anger, blinding and sudden, overrode my shock. My hands shook violently as I unclasped my purse and pulled out my phone. My fingers felt numb, clumsy against the screen as I opened the camera application. I nearly dropped the device into my water glass, but pure adrenaline forced my grip tight. I hit record. I zoomed in, capturing the undeniable evidence. I recorded the flickering candlelight illuminating my father's profile. I recorded the stranger's manicured hand resting near his. I recorded the cream envelope and the discarded signet ring. I watched the man who had taught me the value of absolute honesty engaging in a quiet, shadowy betrayal. The video was clear, stable enough to be damning, and deeply, irrevocably destructive. I stopped the recording. I did not pause to weigh the consequences. I did not engage the part of my brain trained to analyze risk and fallout. I was purely a daughter bleeding from a sudden wound. I opened my message thread with my mother, attached the video file, and typed out a single, definitive sentence. "Mom, you need to see this now." I pressed send. The small notification sound of the message departing felt like the pulling of a grenade pin. The following minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity. Nolan tried to reach across the table to take my hand, murmuring soft words of comfort, but I pulled away. My skin felt too hot, my mind racing through 1,000 fractured memories of my parents, now tainted by the reality playing on a loop in my phone. My father stood up from his booth, slipping the envelope into his breast pocket and sliding the ring back onto his finger. He looked completely at ease, entirely unaware that his world was about to end. And then, the heavy mahogany doors of St. Clair House swung open. The winter chill swept into the warm foyer, parting the crowd of waiting patrons. My mother, Elena Garcia, stepped into the light. She was wearing her structured trench coat, the belt pulled tight, and her posture was as rigid as a marble statue. I searched her face for tears, for the devastation I had just inflicted upon her, but there were no tears. Her face was forged from cold, unforgiving steel. Her eyes swept the room, locked onto the private corner where my father stood, and narrowed with a terrifying, calculating precision. As she began to walk across the dining room, her heels clicking like a metronome counting down to 0. The air left the room. I sat in my chair, the phone heavy in my lap, and realized with chilling clarity that I had just crossed a threshold. There would be no going back. The perfect family I had known an hour ago was dead, and I was the one who had struck the match to burn it down. My mother did not scream. She did not throw her purse, nor did she march up to the table with the frantic energy of a woman betrayed. Instead, she moved through the dining room with a terrifying, predatory grace. The ambient chatter of the restaurant seemed to die away in her wake, as if the other patrons subconsciously sensed the drop in barometric pressure. I watched her navigate the narrow pathways between the tables, my fingernails digging so hard into my own palms that I felt the skin threaten to break. When she reached the secluded booth, the air around them seemed to solidify into ice. My father had been leaning forward, speaking in that low, urgent tone, but as the shadow of my mother fell over his table, the words died in his throat. He looked up. For a fraction of a second, his expression was entirely blank, wiped clean by the sheer impossibility of her presence. Then, a complex micro-expression flashed across his features, not the simple, wide-eyed panic of a cheater caught in the act, but something darker, heavier, and far more desperate. Elena Garcia did not look at him immediately. Her eyes dropped to the pristine white tablecloth. She looked at the heavy gold signet ring sitting next to the flickering candle. Then, she shifted her gaze to the cream envelope, and finally, to the woman sitting across from him. She took her time, letting the silence stretch until it became an agonizing physical weight pressing down on everyone in the vicinity. Finally, she looked into my father's eyes and delivered a single, flat sentence that stopped the breath in my lungs. "So this is where you have been disappearing to." The volume of her voice was completely conversational, yet it cut through the dining room like a surgical blade. It was devoid of tears, devoid of hysteria. It was the sound of a woman who had just calculated the exact cost of her entire life burning to the ground. I waited for the explosion. I waited for my father to shoot up from his seat, to knock over his water glass, to stutter through a barrage of panicked denials. I wanted him to say it was a misunderstanding, a bizarre coincidence, a meeting about an acquisition he could not discuss. I needed him to give me a lie I could force myself to believe. Instead, Daniel Garcia did the worst possible thing. He remained completely, devastatingly silent. He looked at my mother, his jaw working as if he were trying to chew on words that refused to form. He did not reach for her hand. He did not step away from the table. His silence echoed louder than a confession. To me, watching from the shadows of my own booth, it was the ultimate confirmation of his guilt. He was a man who had run out of moves. I tore my eyes away from my father and looked at the woman, Tessa, in every movie, in every cliché. The mistress in this scenario possessed a certain smugness, a quiet victory in finally dragging the secret into the light. But Tessa looked nothing like a victor. All the color had drained from her face, leaving her skin an ashen, sickly gray. She was not looking at my mother with defiance. She was looking past her, her eyes darting toward the restaurant's heavy front doors, then toward the kitchen exit. She reached down and grabbed the strap of her leather handbag. Her knuckles turned stark white under the restaurant lighting. She looked less like a homewrecker and more like a cornered animal terrified of a predator that no one else could see. It was a disjointed, jarring reaction. It did not fit the narrative of a romantic affair, and that tiny incongruity planted a cold, sharp seed of unease deep in my stomach. But the anger thrumming in my veins was too loud for me to process it then. My mother stepped half an inch closer to the table, invading his space, forcing him to look up at her. She began to speak again, her voice still quiet, but now laced with a venom that made me shiver. 3 months, Daniel, she said, each word a measured strike. 3 months of you coming to bed at 2 a.m, 3 months of emergency meetings that never ended up on your assistant's calendar. All those weekends you spent locked in your study, staring at the wall, while I sat outside asking you what was wrong. You told me it was market pressure. You told me it was just the stress of the new quarter. She let out a laugh that contained no humor, only sharp, broken glass. Was this the stress? Was it difficult? Trying to figure out how to split your life down the middle? My father finally stood up. He smoothed the front of his suit jacket, a nervous tic I had not seen him do since I was a child. He looked at my mother, his eyes pleading, but there was a strange rigidity to his posture. "Elena, please," he said. His voice was a harsh whisper. "Not here, not like this. I just need one more night." A physical wave of nausea washed over me. One more night. It was not a denial. It was not an explanation. It was the desperate bargaining of a guilty man begging for enough time to cover his tracks, to pack his bags, or to invent a better lie. It was the final nail in the coffin of his integrity. Beside me, Nolan leaned in close, his arm wrapped around my shoulders, solid and warm, anchoring me to the booth as my reality spun out of control. "I am so sorry, Violet," Nolan whispered into my hair. His voice was thick with sympathy, perfectly calibrated to comfort me. "You have to know, a man only says something like that when he is backed entirely into a corner. He is out of options. He just wants time to control the narrative." Nolan was right. Of course he was right. It was the logical conclusion, the exact same risk assessment I would have made in any of my corporate audits. When the subject asks for time without providing data, they are hiding the liability. My father was the liability. The standoff at the table shattered abruptly. My mother, having delivered the fatal blow, refused to stay and watch the corpse bleed. She turned on her heel, her trench coat flaring, and began the long walk back toward the entrance. She did not look back. My father took a step to follow her, then stopped. He looked back at Tessa. It was a brief, agonizing hesitation, a silent exchange of panic between the two of them that I could not decipher. That hesitation cost him. By the time he lunged forward to chase after my mother, she was already pushing through the heavy mahogany doors, disappearing into the Denver night. Chaos erupted in a muted, polite, upper-class way. The surrounding tables began to whisper violently. The maitre d' scrambled to intercept my father, who pushed past him without a word, leaving his coat, his ring, and the woman behind. Tessa did not stay. The moment my father was out of sight, she sprang from the booth. She moved with frantic, uncoordinated speed, abandoning her half-full wine glass. She practically ran down the aisle, her head ducked low. Her path to the exit took her directly past my booth. As she hurried by, a waiter stepped backward, blocking her way for a fraction of a second. Tessa collided hard with the edge of our table. The impact jarred my open purse, which was sitting on the edge of the leather seat. "Excuse me," she choked out, her voice trembling violently. She scrambled to steady herself, her hands frantically brushing against the leather of my bag as she pushed past the waiter and sprinted for the door. I barely registered the physical contact. I was too busy staring at the empty space where my family had just died. It would not be until hours later that I would realize her clumsy collision was not an accident at all, but a sleight of hand. As the restaurant slowly began to exhale, attempting to return to its facade of high society normalcy, I rested my forehead against my hands. I felt Nolan rubbing my back, whispering that we should go home, that he would handle the check, that I did not have to deal with this tonight. I turned my head to agree with him, my vision blurred with unshed tears. As I did, my gaze swept past the large floral arrangement separating our section from the bar area. Sitting alone at a small, elevated table was a man in a dark gray jacket. He was not looking at his menu. He was not looking at his drink. He was holding his smartphone up. The camera lenses pointed squarely at the empty booth where my father and Tessa had just been sitting. He slowly lowered the device, his thumb tapping the screen to stop a recording. A cold dread, entirely separate from the heartbreak, washed over my spine. I had sent a video to my mother in a moment of emotional hemorrhage. But I was not the only one watching tonight. I was not the only one recording. The private destruction of the Garcia family was no longer contained within the walls of St. Clair House. The match had been struck, but someone else was about to pour the gasoline. By 6 o'clock the next morning, my phone was practically melting on the nightstand. The frantic vibration against the wood was the first sign that the nightmare had not ended with the sunrise. It had multiplied. I grabbed the device, my eyes burning from a sleepless night, and opened a flood of text messages and missed calls. The link everyone was sending pointed to a notoriously aggressive Denver social media account. The footage was not mine. It was captured from the elevated bar area. Grainy but unmistakably clear in its intent, it showed my father and Tessa, the intimate lean, the discarded ring, and the swift, devastating exit of my mother. In less than 8 hours, the clip had amassed hundreds of thousands of views. The private agony of the Garcia family had been served up as public entertainment, dissected by strangers who knew nothing about us but felt entitled to judge everything. The captions speculated wildly about mistresses, hidden corporate funds, and the imminent divorce of a logistics empire founder. I threw on clothes and drove straight to my parents' house. The sprawling estate, usually a warm beacon of Sunday dinners and loud laughter, felt like a crime scene. The air inside was heavy and suffocating. My mother had locked herself inside her ground-floor study. I knocked, pleaded, and pressed my forehead against the heavy oak door for 20 minutes, but the only response was a chilling, absolute silence. No one was looking at each other. The housekeeper moved like a ghost, avoiding my gaze entirely. I walked into the kitchen and stopped dead. On the marble island, sitting squarely in the center, was my father's vintage leather-banded watch. He never left the house without it. Tucked beneath the polished steel casing was a small piece of heavy stationery. The handwriting was rushed, the strokes sharp and erratic, entirely unlike his usual meticulous script. "You saw a piece, not the whole." I stared at the 9 words until the letters blurred. It was not an apology. It was a cryptic defense that only fueled the chaotic fire burning in my chest. He had left before dawn, abandoning his home without a face-to-face explanation. By 9 o'clock, the corporate fallout hit like a sledgehammer. My phone buzzed with a priority news alert. The board of directors at Cobalt Meridian Logistics had convened an emergency dawn meeting. They had officially suspended Daniel Garcia from his role as co-founder and executive officer, pending a full internal review. The press release cited potential conflicts of interest and severe damage to the company's public reputation. My father's life work, an empire he had bled for over 3 decades, was being ripped from his hands before breakfast. The speed of the corporate execution was terrifying. It felt entirely too fast for a simple infidelity scandal. Needing to ground myself in routine, I drove back to my apartment to gather my laptop and head to the Alder Metrics group office. As I dumped the contents of my evening clutch into my everyday work tote, a small, thick piece of cardstock fluttered onto the rug. I picked it up. It was a matte black business card with crisp silver lettering. Holloway Archival Services. The name Holloway sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through my system. It was Tessa. She must have slipped it into my open purse during her frantic, clumsy exit the night before. I flipped the card over. Written on the back, in hurried black ink, were 4 words that made the blood freeze in my veins. "Do not trust Nolan." My immediate reaction was a visceral surge of anger. It was a dirty, manipulative psychological trick. This woman, the architect of my family's destruction, was now trying to isolate me from the only person who had stood by me. She wanted to plant paranoia in my mind, to sever my safest anchor. I marched toward the kitchen trash can, fully intending to rip the card into tiny shreds, but a deeply ingrained instinct from my years in risk analysis stopped my hand. You never destroy an anomaly, you file it. I slid the card into the zippered pocket of my wallet. That afternoon, the paranoia began to feel less like a psychological trick and more like a physical threat. I left my office building at 3 o'clock, needing to clear my head with a drive. When I reached my parking spot in the underground garage, I noticed the driver's side door was slightly ajar. Panic seized my throat. I approached cautiously, my keys gripped tightly in my fist like a weapon. The interior of my car had been systematically ransacked. The glove compartment hung open. manuals and registration papers scattered across the floor mats. The center console was emptied, yet my emergency cash envelope was untouched. My expensive sunglasses were still sitting in the cup holder. Whoever had broken in was not looking for a quick payday. I frantically mentally cataloged what I had left in the car. Then, it hit me. The small, printed valet parking receipt from St. Clair House. I had tossed it into the center console on the drive home. It was the only thing missing. Someone wanted proof of exactly when I had arrived and departed the restaurant. Someone was tracking the timeline. I called Nolan from the locked safety of my car, my voice trembling as I explained the break-in. He arrived at my apartment less than 20 minutes later, looking impeccably sharp in his tailored suit, bringing takeout and a leather portfolio. He held me, checked the locks on my apartment door, and poured me a glass of water. He was playing the role of the perfect, protective partner. But as we sat at the kitchen island, he unzipped his portfolio and pulled out a stack of legally formatted documents. "Violet, I know this is a nightmare," Nolan said, his tone smooth and deeply pragmatic. "But you have to protect yourself. Aldermetrics handles sensitive data for major firms. If your name stays tied to this catastrophic PR mess, your career will take a massive hit. I had my firm draft a public statement for you. It legally distances you from Daniel and the scandal." I looked down at the paper. It was a cold, brutal severing of ties, wrapped in corporate jargon. "And regarding Cobalt Meridian," Nolan continued, tapping his expensive pen against the table, "I have been talking to some people. To stabilize the situation and keep the stock from completely tanking, you should advise your mother to endorse Owen Mercer. As your father's right-hand man, Owen stepping in as interim CEO is the only logical move to calm the shareholders." I stared at him. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. My father's empire was burning. My mother was a ghost. My car had just been targeted by a professional, and my fiancé was sitting at my dining table, pushing me to sign legal documents and install Owen Mercer on the throne. The timing was entirely too perfect. The logic was entirely too flawless. The solution was too neatly packaged for a crisis that had only exploded 12 hours ago. Nolan looked at me with deep, comforting eyes, waiting for me to take the pen. But in that exact moment, the seed of doubt cracked open, taking root in the darkest corner of my mind. I thought of the black business card hidden in my wallet. Suddenly, the words on the back did not feel like a mistress's desperate lie. They felt like a warning from a battlefield I did not yet know I was standing on. I locked myself in my bedroom and opened the video file. I told myself I was doing it to face the pain, to force myself to accept the new reality. I thought staring at the betrayal would eventually numb the open wound. But my professional instincts, honed over thousands of hours of data analysis, began to override my grief. I am trained to look for anomalies, to find the single pixel that does not belong in the larger picture. I slowed the playback speed down to a quarter of its original rate. I watched the disaster unfold frame by frame. At this glacial, analytical pace, the narrative of a passionate affair began to fracture violently. I focused entirely on Tessa. I studied her micro-expressions. She was not gazing at my father with the adoration of a secret lover. Her eyes were constantly darting away from him. She was tracking the waitstaff, monitoring the heavy mahogany doors, and checking the reflection in the decorative mirrors lining the walls. Her facial muscles were pulled taut, her jaw clenched tight enough to cause pain. She was not a woman basking in stolen time. She was a sentry keeping watch. She was terrified. I paused the video and zoomed in on the table surface, pushing the resolution of my phone camera to its absolute digital limit. During the actual confrontation, I had been completely blinded by my father taking off his heavy gold signet ring, but looking closer at the pixelated image, I noticed a small, dark object sitting right next to his water glass. In the dim lighting of the restaurant, my biased mind had immediately categorized it as a velvet jewelry box, perhaps a lavish gift he was presenting to his mistress alongside the cream envelope. Magnified. The truth was starkly different. The object had no soft velvet lining, No padded interior designed to hold a necklace or a pair of earrings. It was constructed of rigid matte polymer with a heavy metallic hinge. It looked exactly like a secure, waterproof storage capsule, the kind specifically designed to transport encrypted flash drives or highly sensitive digital microcomponents. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. I threw open my laptop and accessed a backdoor data aggregation tool I frequently used for deep corporate background checks at Alder Metrics Group. I needed to know who had actually booked that specific private booth at St. Clair House. After routing through a few public reservation logs and cross-referencing credit card transaction times from the restaurant's unsecured guest network, I found the booking ledger. The table was not registered under Daniel Garcia. It had been booked under the name Grayfin Consulting. That name triggered an immediate, blaring red flag in my memory. Grayfin was a boutique internal audit firm that Cobalt Meridian Logistics had hired 3 years ago to review their international shipping compliance protocols. 6 months into the contract, Grayfin had abruptly vanished from all vendor records. Their invoices were settled quietly. Their personnel disappeared from the building, and their final reports were entirely buried. I opened a new search window, my fingers flying across the keys with desperate speed. I typed in the name from the black business card I had found in my purse Holloway. I cross-referenced it with the employee history databases of Cobalt Meridian. The search results materialized instantly, and the air in my bedroom turned freezing cold. Simon Holloway. He was not just a random former employee, he was the former director of compliance and my father's oldest, most trusted friend within the corporate hierarchy. But Simon was not a factor anymore because, according to every news outlet and obituary published 14 months ago, Simon Holloway had drowned in a tragic, solitary boating accident on a remote lake. Tessa Holloway was not a homewrecker. She was a grieving widow. The walls of my apartment suddenly felt like a trap closing in on me. When Nolan called me at 7 o'clock to say he had an emergency client dinner and would not be over until late, the lie sounded completely hollow. His smooth, comforting tone no longer felt protective. It felt calculated. I did not stay home. I grabbed my car keys, waited 10 minutes, and drove directly to his downtown office building. I parked 3 blocks away and walked to the entrance of his private underground parking garage. The air smelled of damp concrete and heavy exhaust. I slipped past the security gate and waited in the deep shadows of a structural pillar for over an hour. At 8:15, a sleek black sedan pulled into the subterranean level. It did not park in a visitor spot. It idled near the service elevators. The driver's side door opened, and Owen Mercer stepped out. A minute later, the heavy metal door of the stairwell creaked open, and Nolan emerged. They did not shake hands. The body language between my fiancé and my father's right-hand man was tense, urgent, and deeply conspiratorial. I crept closer, pressing my back against a cold concrete wall, holding my breath until my lungs burned. The acoustic properties of the underground garage amplified their low voices, just enough for me to catch fragments of the conversation. Nolan was pacing, checking his phone repeatedly, looking agitated. Mercer stood perfectly still, exuding a cold authority. Then, Mercer delivered a sentence that hit me like a physical strike to the chest. "If Daniel still has the widow's file, we are done." I fled the garage before either of them could spot me, my mind spiraling into absolute chaos. I drove erratically across the city to my parents' estate, desperate to warn my mother that the threat was not a divorce, but something far more dangerous. I arrived at 10:30. The heavy oak front door was unlocked, which was a terrifying anomaly in itself. I ran down the hallway to the ground floor study. My mother was standing in the center of the room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, staring blankly at a shattered window pane. The room had been professionally and violently tossed. But as my eyes scanned the wreckage, the horrifying reality of the situation crystallized. My mother's expensive art collection was untouched. The heavy silver antique clock still sat squarely on the mantel. The emergency cash in the desk drawer was ignored. The only things missing were the secondary backup laptop hidden in her bottom filing drawer and the external hard drives from the locked safe. It was not a random burglary. It was a targeted, surgical data extraction. I stood amidst the scattered papers on the Persian rug, and the most devastating realization of my entire life finally snapped into focus. My father was not having a midlife crisis. He was not tearing our family apart for a younger woman. He was conducting a clandestine meeting with the widow of a dead man to secure highly sensitive audit files. He was trying to protect his company, his legacy, and possibly his own life, and I, in my blind, self-righteous, impulsive anger, had filmed the entire handover. I had misunderstood absolutely everything, and by sending that video to my mother, I had blown his cover to the world. I had detonated a bomb in the middle of a covert operation I was too ignorant to see. I had unwittingly handed the ultimate advantage directly to the men actively trying to destroy him. I reached into the pocket of my coat and pulled out my wallet. I unzipped the hidden compartment and slid out the matte black business card. The silver lettering of Holloway Archival Services gleamed under the harsh overhead light of the ruined study. My hands were no longer shaking with grief. They were remarkably steady, hardened by a profound, freezing clarity. I pulled out my phone, typed in the 10 digits listed on the card, and pressed the call button. I held the device to my ear, listening to the ringing tone, stepping willingly into the dark, dangerous undercurrent of the war I had accidentally started. The voice on the other end of the line was brief, metallic, and completely devoid of pleasantries. The instructions dictated that I drive 45 minutes north of the city limits to an abandoned parish sitting in the shadow of the foothills. I was told to leave my cell phone inside the glove compartment of my car, lock the doors, and walk around to the side entrance near the dilapidated graveyard. I followed every command with a numb mechanical precision. The ground beneath my boots was hard and frozen, crunching loudly as I approached the heavy, weather-beaten wooden door of the church. I pushed it open. The interior smelled of damp stone and decades of neglect. Sunlight filtered weakly through cracked, stained glass, casting fractured patterns across the empty, dust-covered pews. Standing near the altar, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, was Tessa. Without the dim, romantic lighting of a high-end restaurant, she looked entirely different. She looked exhausted, her eyes rimmed with deep purple shadows. She did not greet me. She simply nodded toward a narrow doorway leading into the vestry behind the altar. I walked past her, my pulse hammering a frantic rhythm against my throat. I pushed open the vestry door. Standing in the center of the small, windowless room was a man I had mourned over a year ago. I stopped breathing. My vision narrowed until he was the only thing in focus. The man wore a faded fleece jacket and dark denim, his beard grown out thick and untidy, but his posture and the sharp, intelligent gaze were unmistakable. It was Simon Holloway. The man who was supposed to be resting at the bottom of a remote alpine lake was standing 5 feet away from me, very much alive. The shock was a physical blow. The floor felt as though it had violently dropped a foot beneath me. I reached out and gripped the edge of a wooden table to keep from collapsing. I tried to speak, to demand an explanation, but the words withered in my dry mouth. "I am sorry, Violet," Simon said, his voice rough and underused. "I know what this looks like. I know what you have been put through." He gestured to a folding chair, and I collapsed into it. Slowly, deliberately, Simon began to dismantle the reality I had believed in for the past 14 months. He had not drowned. The boating accident had been a carefully staged exit strategy. He had been forced to vanish after stumbling into a massive, heavily insulated financial black hole deep within the accounting infrastructure of Cobalt Meridian Logistics. Simon explained the mechanics of the fraud, his words painting a terrifying picture of corporate rot. For the last 4 years, millions of dollars had been systematically siphoned out of the company. The thieves were bleeding dry the emergency medical supply routes, inflating logistical overhead costs by hundreds of %, and routing the excess capital through untraceable offshore shell companies. Worse, they had recently begun draining the employee pension funds to cover the widening deficits. "The architecture of the theft was brilliant," Simon said, leaning against the cold stone wall. "It was entirely invisible to standard regulatory audits. The man pulling the strings? The one authorizing the ghost contracts and signing off on the diverted shipments is Owen Mercer. Hearing Mercer's name was a jolt, but it made a sick kind of sense. Mercer had always been ambitious, always hungry for the control my father held, but Simon was not finished. He took a slow breath, his eyes locking onto mine with a heavy, devastating pity. Owen is the face of the operation, Simon continued, his tone dropping an octave. But he does not have the technical capability to build the backdoor algorithms or scrub the data trails clean. He needed an architect. He needed an auditor who knew exactly how to manipulate the risk assessment software to blind the internal compliance team. He needed your fiancé. The silence in the vestry became absolute. The air turned to ash in my lungs. Nolan, my steady, reliable, perfect Nolan. The man who held me while I cried over my shattered family. The man who had pushed me to sign legal documents separating myself from my father. He was the one building the labyrinth to hide stolen millions. Tessa is not your father's mistress, Simon said gently, breaking through my rising panic. She is my legal wife. She is the only person on this earth I trust. When I realized Mercer was going to have me killed before I could blow the whistle, I had to disappear, but I could not leave Daniel completely unprotected. He was my oldest friend. Tessa became the courier. She was the only one who could move physical evidence between my hiding places and your father without triggering Mercer's surveillance network. My mind raced backward, slamming into the memory of the dinner at St. Clair House. Every detail I had recorded, every gesture I had condemned, suddenly inverted itself with horrifying clarity. The handhold, I whispered, my voice sounding completely foreign to my own ears. Comfort, Tessa said, stepping into the vestry from the sanctuary. I was terrified. Violet. I was carrying the master decryption keys to Mercer's offshore accounts. If I was caught, Simon's sacrifice meant nothing, and I would likely be killed. Your father took my hand to keep me from falling apart right there in the restaurant. And the ring? I asked, my chest tight. It is a hollow shell, Simon answered. Daniel had a jeweler carve out the interior of his signet ring months ago. It houses a micro-capacity memory card. Tessa passed him the sealed envelope with the encrypted hard copies, and in exchange, he left the ring on the table for her to collect. It contained the biometric access codes I needed to retrieve the final pieces of the puzzle. The truth was an agonizing weight pressing down on my shoulders. But when my mother walked in, I stammered, desperately trying to piece the fractured timeline together. When she accused him, why did he not say anything? Why did he let her believe he was cheating? He just stood there and took it. Because he saw the man at the bar, Simon said, his expression hardening into cold fury. Daniel has been fighting a shadow war for a year. He is hypervigilant. He spotted the operative aiming a camera at the booth right before Elena reached the table. If Daniel had defended himself, if he had tried to explain about me, or the audit files, or Mercer, he would have exposed the entire operation on camera. He would have signed my death warrant and his own. He chose to look like a guilty, unfaithful husband because a divorce scandal was the only cover story that kept the witness protection chain intact. Tears, hot and bitter, finally spilled over my eyelashes. My father had sacrificed his marriage, his reputation, and his relationship with me in a split-second decision to keep his friend alive, and I had destroyed him anyway. Simon stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on the wooden table. There is one last thing you need to know, Violet, and it is going to hurt worse than the rest. I looked up at him, bracing myself for the final impact. The video you took, Simon said quietly, the one you sent to your mother. We tracked the IP address of the anonymous account that leaked the secondary footage online the next morning. The leak was not orchestrated by a random gossip blogger. The man at the bar was a hired operative, but the person who weaponized the footage, the person who coordinated the social media drop to ensure Daniel was suspended by the board before the audit could be presented, was Nolan. The revelation was a clean surgical strike straight through my heart. Nolan had not just betrayed me, he had weaponized my own pain. He had recognized the golden opportunity my impulsive text message created. He used my heartbreak as a corporate assassination tool to remove the only man standing between him and total control of the company. I had been nothing more than a convenient, predictable asset. I sat in the cold, damp vestry of the abandoned church, surrounded by ghosts and shattered truths. A weaker version of myself would have shattered completely. I could have driven home, confronted Nolan with tears and screaming, and let the entire conspiracy collapse into a messy, emotional domestic dispute. I could have let Mercer win. Instead, a profound, chilling calmness settled over my bones. The grief and the humiliation burned away, leaving behind something entirely different. It was a cold, calculated fury. I wiped the tears from my cheeks and stood up from the folding chair. I looked at Simon, then at Tessa, the two people who had risked everything to fight in the dark. I was not going to confront Nolan. I was not going to tell my mother. I was going to go back to my apartment, smile at the man who had turned my life into a weapon, and learn exactly how to use it against him. I looked Simon dead in the eyes and asked him where we were going to start. The safe house was a sterile, sparsely furnished apartment on the industrial north side of the city, loaned to us by a contact Simon trusted implicitly. When I walked through the dead-bolted door, my father was standing by the single window, staring out at the brick wall of the adjacent building. He looked a decade older than he had at the restaurant. We did not rush into a dramatic, tearful embrace. The space between us was heavily weighted with the jagged debris of our mutual mistakes. "I should have told you," he said quietly, his voice carrying a deep, exhausted rasp. "I thought building an absolute wall of silence would keep you and your mother completely clean if this entire operation collapsed." I shook my head, fighting the painful tightening in my throat. "Your silence made me blind, Dad," and my impulsiveness handed them the detonator. I confessed to recording the video, to sending it to my mother in a fit of righteous, misguided anger. He did not yell. He just nodded slowly, the lines around his mouth deepening into trenches of regret. The fracture in our relationship was severe, born of a profound lack of trust, but beneath that crack, a new, hardened foundation was beginning to set. We both understood the grim reality of our situation. We had absolutely no luxury for tears, and no time to heal the emotional wounds. We had a war to win, and the enemy already held the high ground. Back in my own element, I transformed my guest bedroom into a clandestine digital war room. Tessa met me in the subterranean parking garage of a suburban grocery store to hand over a heavily encrypted physical ledger and a cheap, untraceable prepaid cellular phone. A day later, Simon transmitted a list of the shell corporations that had been systematically bleeding the corporate accounts dry. They were names that sounded perfectly legitimate on paper, but were entirely hollow upon inspection. Using the highly specialized forensic access protocols I utilized daily at Alder Metrics Group, I began the painstaking process of resurrecting the deleted transaction flows. I spent night after night bathed in the blue light of my monitors, cross-referencing invoice dates against altered server access logs. I tracked Internet Protocol addresses bouncing through virtual private networks, aligning them meticulously with the suspicious payment models Simon had identified. I was mapping the architecture of the theft. It was grueling, invisible work, but it was exactly what I was trained to do. I was no longer a panicked, heartbroken daughter. I was a data risk analyst dismantling a hostile infrastructure, brick by digital brick. The most agonizing part of the strategy was not the complex data analysis. It was returning to my apartment, unlocking the door, and sleeping next to the enemy. I had to perform the role of a devastated, entirely dependent partner, and Nolan made it sickeningly easy to play along. I sat on our velvet sofa, wrapped tightly in a blanket, and manufactured tears as I told him my mother was officially consulting ruthless divorce attorneys. I told him my father was a broken, isolated shell of a man who had completely stopped fighting the board's suspension. I played the victim perfectly, and Nolan swallowed the lie whole. Convinced that the Garcia family was shattered beyond repair, his comforting facade began to slip. revealing the cold, calculating ambition underneath. He started pressing me, gently at first, then with increasing urgency, to accelerate our wedding date. He suggested moving the ceremony up by 6 months. "We need to show the board of directors a stable, unified front, Violet," he argued one evening, pouring me a glass of expensive wine. "With your father out, the shareholders are panicking. If we solidify our partnership now, it stabilizes the family image." He even slid a thick manila folder across the kitchen island, heavily suggesting I sign over my personal trusts into a joint investment portfolio. "It is just a precaution to safeguard your personal assets from the corporate fallout," he lied smoothly. I looked at the dotted line, smiled weakly, and promised I would review the documents with my lawyer. Every word out of his mouth was a calculated maneuver to secure legal control over my family's voting shares. I needed hard, undeniable proof of Nolan's direct physical involvement with Owen Mercer's enforcers. Digital footprints were strong, but physical coordination was the killing blow. I decided to manufacture a vulnerability. One morning, while Nolan was buttoning his dress shirt for work, I casually mentioned that my father had been acting highly erratic. I fabricated a story about sneaking into his temporary apartment and finding a cryptic toll booth receipt in his jacket pocket. I told Nolan I suspected my father had driven up to our family's remote lake property to hide his master physical hard drives. "I am just so worried he is losing his mind and destroying evidence," I whispered, resting my head against Nolan's chest. I felt his heartbeat accelerate perfectly against my cheek. He kissed my forehead, told me not to worry about a thing, and practically sprinted out the door for his office. I did not go to work that day. I drove 3 hours north to the lake house. The property was deeply isolated, surrounded by dense, towering pine trees. I spent the entire afternoon installing 4 high-definition, motion-activated tactical cameras. I hid the tiny lenses inside the air vents, behind the living room bookshelves, and angled downward from the exterior porch eaves. On the heavy oak desk in my father's study, I placed a decoy external hard drive, loaded with thousands of pages of meaningless, publicly available corporate compliance manuals. Then, I locked the doors, wiped my fingerprints from the handles, and drove back to the city, returning to my apartment just an hour before Nolan walked in from his workday. 36 hours later, the silent alert flashed on my encrypted burner phone. Sitting in my locked office cubicle at Alder Metrics, I opened the live feed. The trap had snapped shut flawlessly. The exterior cameras captured Nolan arriving at the property at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He did not break a window or force the door. He simply walked to the hidden lockbox under the back porch steps, retrieved the spare key he knew about from our previous summer trips, and unlocked the deadbolt. He left the front door slightly off the latch, ensuring easy entry, and drove away. At exactly 2 o'clock the following morning, the interior cameras flared to life. 2 men dressed entirely in dark tactical clothing slipped through the unlocked front door. They moved with terrifying professional efficiency, completely bypassing the expensive electronics and heading straight for the study. The high-resolution lens captured them grabbing the decoy hard drive off the desk, slipping it into a padded bag, and exiting into the night. I watched the recording replay on my monitor, my breath perfectly steady. The connection between Nolan's daytime preparation and Mercer's nighttime thieves was now irrevocably documented in high definition. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, a slow, freezing smile spreading across my face. They had stolen a completely useless drive, but I possessed the entire damning narrative. For the very first time since this nightmare began, I was not merely reacting to their destruction. I was the one holding the scalpel, and I was orchestrating the exact manner in which they would bleed. I traced a flagged geolocation ping from one of Owen Mercer's compromised calendar accounts to the mezzanine lounge of the Grand Monarch Hotel. It was exactly 4 o'clock on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I navigated the plush, dimly lit carpet of the upper level, expecting to document Mercer coordinating with another corrupt corporate executive or handing off a bribe. I positioned myself behind a thick marble pillar, my phone ready to capture the evidence. When I finally found his table in the secluded back corner, the sight completely paralyzed me. Sitting across from the man actively trying to destroy my father, sipping sparkling water with immaculate, terrifying poise, was my mother. Elena Garcia did not look like a woman under duress. She was leaning forward, her tone conversational, even offering a faint, polite smile as Mercer spoke. I watched them for 20 minutes. My hands shook so violently I had to lean against the cold stone pillar to remain upright. Every instinct I had carefully rebuilt over the last several days shattered instantly. My father was living like a fugitive in a sterile safe house, bleeding out his legacy, and my mother was having an afternoon drink with the architect of his execution. I waited until Mercer stood up, buttoned his tailored suit jacket, and walked toward the elevators. I gave my mother exactly 5 minutes to finish her drink and head for the valet station. I intercepted her in the underground parking garage. I stepped out from behind a concrete column just as she reached her car. She did not flinch. She simply paused, her car keys held loosely in her manicured hand, and looked at me with an expression carved from glacial ice. I demanded to know what I had just witnessed. I asked her how she could possibly sit across from that man and smile while our entire family was being dismantled. My mother unlocked her car, her voice devoid of any maternal warmth. "You need to stop playing amateur detective, Violet," she said, her words sharp and dismissive. "If Daniel is absolutely determined to sink his own ship with this paranoid crusade, I will not let him drag this entire family down into the freezing water with him. You need to focus on your career and your upcoming wedding. Leave the corporate salvage operations to people who understand how the world actually works." She got into her car, closed the door, and drove away, leaving me standing alone in the damp exhaust fumes of the garage. I felt a hollow, sickening certainty wash over me. My mother had assessed the battlefield, realized my father was fighting a losing war, and negotiated a surrender to save herself. That night, a relentless gnawing instinct refused to let me sleep. My mother had always been fiercely loyal. Her sudden capitulation felt too neat, too aggressively cold. I drove to the family estate knowing she would be attending a charity board dinner until late in the evening. The house was entirely dark. I bypassed the security system using a backdoor code I had programmed years ago and went straight to her ground floor study. I bypassed the decoy files and the superficial paperwork she kept on her desk. I knelt beside her heavy antique credenza. The bottom drawer was always locked. When I was a teenager, I had figured out how to slip a metal letter opener into the ancient brass mechanism to release the catch. I did it now. My breath shallow and rapid in the silent house. The drawer slid open. Inside, I found no love letters, no evidence of an affair, and no divorce papers. It was packed with dense, heavily redacted financial documents. I pulled the thickest folder out and began reading by the narrow beam of my flashlight. They were property deeds, lines of credit, and complex proxy shareholder agreements. I read the dates. The timeline stretched back over 3 years. My mother had secretly mortgaged her beloved, highly successful art gallery. She had liquidated her personal trusts. She had taken every ounce of independent wealth she possessed and used it to quietly purchase hundreds of thousands of fragmented voting shares in Cobalt Meridian Logistics through a dozen untraceable dummy corporations. She was not abandoning my father. She was quietly building a massive, hidden financial firewall to protect his controlling stake in the company. The study door clicked open. The overhead lights flared on, blinding me for a fraction of a second. My mother stood in the doorway, her heavy evening coat draped over her arm. She looked at me sitting on the Persian rug, surrounded by her life's work of secret financial maneuvering. The glacial mask she had worn in the parking garage completely dissolved. She closed the door, walked over to the leather armchair, and sat down, looking suddenly incredibly exhausted. "Owen Mercer came to me 4 months ago," she said, her voice quiet and trembling slightly. "He showed me a fabricated, completely flawless paper trail. He had routed a portion of the stolen logistics funds through dummy accounts that mirrored the risk analysis algorithms you designed at Alder Metrics Group. If your father went public with the evidence of the embezzlement too early, Mercer promised he would press a button and hand the FBI a narrative that proved you were the architect of the fraud. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Mercer was going to frame me for federal insider trading. I had to buy your father time, she continued, looking down at her hands. I had to pretend I believed Mercer's lies about Daniel's incompetence. I had to play the bitter, estranged wife, slowly negotiating a transition of power, just to keep Mercer's focus on me and off of you. I had to let your father think I was pulling away from him. I realized then the profound tragedy of my parents' distance. The coldness that had infected their marriage for the past year was not a lack of love. It was an overabundance of it. My father had hidden his shadow war to protect my mother from the crossfire. My mother had hidden her financial counterinsurgency to protect me from federal prison. They were two fiercely proud, stubbornly independent people fighting the exact same enemy in the dark, unintentionally breaking each other's hearts because they refused to share the burden. I gathered the papers, placed them back in the folder, and walked over to my mother. I knelt beside her chair and took her hands. We did not cry. The stakes were too high for tears. "We have the ledger," I told her, my voice rock steady. "Simon is alive. We have the data to prove everything." My mother squeezed my fingers. Her eyes hardened into something terrifying and magnificent. She officially joined the War Council that night, but she established one absolute, non-negotiable rule. "We do not strike based on emotion," she commanded. "We do not leak documents to the press in the middle of the night. We do not make reckless, anonymous accusations. When we cut Owen Mercer down, we do it in a brightly lit room. We deliver the final blow in a place where he cannot twist the narrative, where he cannot escape, and where everyone who matters is forced to watch him bleed." I agreed. The plan was terrifyingly precise. I left the estate and drove straight to the safe house to brief Simon and my father on the newly discovered proxy shares. When I walked in, Simon was sitting at the dining table, surrounded by hard drives. He looked up at me, his face grim. "Violet, sit down," he said. I took a seat opposite him. He turned his laptop monitor toward me. Displayed on the screen was a digitized guest manifest from a high society charity gala that had taken place exactly 2 years ago. I was running background checks on all of Mercer's known associates to map his network, Simon explained. "I found the funding source for the gala where you first met Nolan Bishop. The entire event was quietly underwritten by the Vanguard Trust." I stared at the name. Vanguard Trust was the primary slush fund Mercer used to wash his stolen capital. "Nolan did not accidentally bump into you by the champagne tower, Violet," Simon said gently, delivering the final, suffocating blow. "He was not a charming stranger who swept you off your feet. He was a strategic asset. Mercer needed a direct, deeply embedded line into the Garcia family's internal dynamics. He needed someone who could monitor Daniel from the inside, influence your career, and eventually secure your voting shares through marriage. Nolan was deployed." My lungs stopped working. My mind raced backward, replaying our entire relationship, the perfectly timed romantic gestures. The way he always knew exactly what to say when I complained about my father's long hours. The way he seamlessly integrated himself into every aspect of my life, becoming my confidant, my protector, my future husband. It was all an acquisition strategy. My love story was a hostile takeover. I sat in the harsh fluorescent light of the safe house and felt the last remaining fragment of my old self completely die. The woman who had cried in the restaurant, the woman who had sought comfort in her fiancé's arms, was gone. From that second onward, the narrative shifted, the anger evaporated, replaced by a terrifying, absolute zero coldness. I did not want to confront Nolan. I did not want to scream at him or demand answers he would only wrap in more lies. I wanted to destroy him. The retaliation was no longer just about saving my father's company. It was about surgical, devastating precision. It was about smiling at the man who slept in my bed, knowing I was going to bury him alive. Nolan poured 2 cups of black coffee and set one softly on the granite kitchen island in front of me. It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 48 hours after I had discovered his true identity. He looked at me with an expression of deeply manufactured sympathy, his brow furrowed in a perfect imitation of a concerned partner. I was wearing one of his oversized collegiate sweaters, intentionally playing the role of a woman shivering in the wreckage of her own life. I pulled the sleeves over my hands and stared blankly at the steam rising from the mug. "Violet, I have been thinking," Nolan said, his voice a low, soothing baritone. He walked around the island and placed his hands gently on my shoulders. "With everything happening, with your father completely spiraling and your mother preparing for a brutal divorce, you are carrying too much weight. I want to give you something certain amidst your family falling apart. Let us move the wedding up. We can do it next month. A small, private ceremony, just us." I looked up at him, forcing my eyes to brim with unshed tears. "Next month," I whispered, letting my voice crack slightly. "Yes," he urged, pressing a soft kiss to the top of my head. "And to make sure you are completely protected from the corporate fallout, my firm drafted a few standard updates to your trust. It is just a routine power of attorney and some financial appendices. It legally walls off your personal assets, so the board of directors cannot freeze your accounts when they officially vote to oust Daniel. It is just a shield. Sweetheart." He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, sliding a heavy silver pen across the counter toward me. My stomach turned into a block of solid ice, but I managed a weak, grateful nod. I told him I needed to read them over in my home office, just to make sure I understood the jargon. Nolan smiled, completely satisfied with his manipulation, and went to take his morning shower. Once the bathroom door clicked shut, I moved with terrifying speed. I took the documents to my scanner. Using my forensic editing software, I altered the microscopic legal coding at the bottom margin of the signature pages, rendering the contracts entirely void in any state court. I printed the worthless photocopies, forged my signature with a slight, deliberate hesitation to mimic an unsteady hand, and slipped the clean, legally binding originals into the hidden compartment of my work tote. When Nolan emerged, smelling of expensive cedar soap, I handed him the signed fakes. He tucked them into his briefcase with a look of quiet triumph. He thought he had just legally acquired my life. I needed him to confess it out loud. Before leaving for my own office, I slipped a microscopic, voice-activated recording node right behind the air conditioning grate in his private study. The payoff came late that evening. Sitting in my car down the street from our apartment building, I listened to the live audio feed through an encrypted channel on my phone. Nolan was pacing his study, the sound of his leather shoes distinct against the hardwood floor. He was on a call with Owen Mercer. "The paperwork is signed," Nolan reported, his tone entirely stripped of the warmth he used with me. It was cold, arrogant, and strictly transactional. She was practically shaking when she handed it over. "She is completely isolated. Once the board executes Daniel's removal on Friday, and she is my legal wife, the Garcia voting bloc falls directly into our hands. We will have unquestioned majority control." I pressed the save button on the interface, locking the audio file into a secure, triple-encrypted server. Every time Nolan nodded at me, every time he squeezed my hand, it was just another knife concealed in his sleeve. Now, I held the blade. The stakes violently accelerated the following afternoon. I received a frantic, scrambled call from Simon. Tessa had been driving down Interstate 70, transporting the final set of physical ledgers from a safety deposit box. A heavy commercial delivery truck with obscured license plates had aggressively swerved into her lane, attempting to crush her sedan against the concrete median barrier. She managed to slam on her brakes and spin out onto the gravel shoulder, escaping with minor injuries and a shattered windshield. The attack confirmed our worst fear. Mercer and his enforcers knew there was a leak. They knew a courier was still moving pieces across the board. The window for a quiet, methodical takedown had officially slammed shut. It was time to go to war. Simon retaliated digitally. Operating out of the safe house, he finally broke through the last firewall of Mercer's compromised cloud storage. What he recovered was not just financial data, it was the smoking gun for a federal criminal indictment. It was a compressed audio file from a burner phone, time-stamped 14 months ago, on the exact night Simon was supposed to have drowned. The recording was brief and chilling. Mercer's voice cut through the static, issuing a direct command: "Make sure Holloway does not make it off that lake." A second later, Nolan responded, his voice crisp and efficient. "Understood. I will scrub the server logs and wipe his digital footprints tonight." It was no longer just corporate embezzlement. It was premeditated attempted murder, and my fiancé was an active accessory. We convened an emergency tactical meeting at the safe house. My father, looking harder and more resolute than I had ever seen him, laid out the final battlefield. The annual Cobalt Meridian Foundation Charity Gala was scheduled for Friday night at the Halcyon Grand Hotel. It was the premier event of the fiscal year, attended by every major investor, the entire board of directors, the local financial press, and the city's elite. Mercer planned to use the gala as his unofficial coronation, where the power restructuring would be formally celebrated behind closed doors. "I am still legally a founding partner until the board finalizes the vote," Daniel said, adjusting his suit jacket. "I invoked my founder's right to address the shareholders. I demanded 5 minutes of speaking time. Mercer thinks I am going up there to publicly resign and apologize to save my pension." "And what about me?" my mother asked, her posture impeccably straight. "You attend exactly as Mercer expects," I told her, mapping out the seating chart on the table. "You arrive separately, you sit near the board members, you play the furious, betrayed wife who has turned her back on her husband. You make Mercer feel completely secure, right up until the second the floor drops out from under him." Elena nodded, her eyes flashing with a dangerous, aristocratic fury. She was ready to play her part flawlessly. Friday evening arrived with the heavy, electric tension of an approaching storm. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in the bedroom of our apartment, dressed in a sweeping midnight blue evening gown. My hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant style. I looked like a woman stepping into high society, but I felt like an assassin stepping onto a firing line. Nolan walked up behind me. He was wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. He smiled at my reflection in the glass, resting his hands on my bare shoulders. He leaned down and kissed the curve of my neck. "You look absolutely breathtaking, Violet," he whispered. "Tonight is going to be a difficult night for your family. But I promise you, once this is all over, everything will be perfect for us." I looked down at my left hand resting on the vanity. The heavy diamond engagement ring caught the bedroom light, throwing sharp, fractured prisms across the wood. It was a beautiful piece of jewelry, purchased with stolen money and given with lethal intent. I looked back up, meeting Nolan's eyes in the mirror. I offered him a soft, entirely hollow smile. "I know," I replied smoothly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Everything changes tonight." I picked up my silk clutch, feeling the hard, rectangular outline of the encrypted flash drive hidden inside the lining. I walked out of the apartment with the man who had plotted to ruin my life. Wearing the ring, I knew with absolute certainty I would be returning to him before midnight. The Halcyon Grand Ballroom was an architectural masterpiece of gold leaf and towering crystal chandeliers, but tonight it felt like a beautifully decorated slaughterhouse. Over 500 guests, the absolute apex of the city's financial sector, major philanthropic donors, and a swarm of financial journalists were packed into the cavernous space. They were not there to celebrate the annual achievements of the Cobalt Meridian Foundation. They were there to witness a corporate execution. The gala had been entirely hijacked, subtly redesigned to serve as a lavish coronation for Owen Mercer. I sat at table number 4, perfectly positioned near the front stage, encased in my midnight blue gown. The air in the room was suffocatingly thick, vibrating with the low, hungry murmur of high society gossip. Everywhere I looked, I saw predators wearing tailored tuxedos and diamond necklaces, sipping champagne while waiting for my father to bleed out professionally, to ensure no one forgot the reason for the impending shift in power. Mercer had arranged for a subtle, devastating psychological weapon. Flanking the massive stage were two towering digital screens, ostensibly there to display donor statistics and philanthropic milestones. Instead, they were playing a continuous, silent loop of the grainy cell phone video from St. Clair House. Every 3 minutes, the entire room could watch my father lean across a candlelit table, strip off his heavy gold signet ring, and take Tessa Holloway's hand. It was a public branding, a silent, irrefutable stain projected in high definition. No one needed to mention the infidelity scandal out loud. The flickering light from the screens washed over the audience, doing the dirty work for them. I looked toward table number 1, reserved for the senior board of directors. My mother, Elena, sat perfectly still in an ash-gray silk dress. Her posture was flawless, her chin raised at a regal angle, but her face was completely devoid of emotion. She was not looking at the screens. She was not looking at me. She stared straight ahead with a glacial emptiness that sent a sudden, paralyzing spike of genuine terror straight through my chest. We had meticulously planned her cold demeanor, but looking at her in the harsh lighting of the gala, a dark, intrusive thought invaded my mind. What if she was not acting? What if Mercer had cornered her again over the last 48 hours? What if the sheer weight of protecting our family had finally broken her, and she had genuinely surrendered her proxy shares to save herself? The uncertainty was a physical ache in my ribs. Underneath the heavy linen tablecloth, Nolan found my hand, his fingers wrapped tightly around mine, his thumb stroking my knuckles. He leaned close to my ear, his breath warm against my skin. "Just breathe, Violet," Nolan whispered, his voice carrying that manufactured, perfect resonance. "I know this is absolute torture to watch, but I promise you, tonight it will all be over." To anyone else, it would have sounded like the ultimate reassurance from a devoted fiancé. To me, knowing he was the architect who had built this entire nightmare, it was a chilling declaration of victory. He was promising me that by the end of the night, my family's legacy would be completely eradicated, and his hostile takeover would be complete. I squeezed his hand back, forcing a frail, entirely fake smile to my lips, burying the urge to scream. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The room went completely dark for 2 seconds before a single, brilliant spotlight snapped onto the center of the stage. Owen Mercer walked out to the podium. He looked like a man who had already conquered the world. He gripped the edges of the wooden lectern, projecting an aura of solemn, reluctant duty. When he spoke, his voice boomed through the sophisticated sound system, dripping with hypocritical sorrow. "Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues, and dedicated partners of the Cobalt Meridian Foundation," Mercer began, his tone perfectly calibrated for maximum emotional manipulation. "We gather tonight to celebrate our philanthropic achievements, but we must also acknowledge the heavy shadow hanging over our corporate family. Leadership requires, above all else, an unwavering commitment to transparency and absolute moral responsibility." He paused, letting the buzzwords sink into the silence. He picked up a heavy, leather-bound folder from the podium. The official board resolution prepared to permanently strip Daniel Garcia of his founder's voting rights and sever him from the company he built. "Recently, we have all been forced to witness the painful reality of a family's private devastation," Mercer continued, gesturing subtly toward the silent video looping on the side screens. "A company is only as strong as the integrity of the man steering the ship. When that integrity shatters, we have a fiduciary duty to step in and restore order. We must heal the breach." Mercer scanned the front rows, his eyes locking onto me. A cold, serpentine smile touched the corners of his mouth. He was going off the established script. "But true transparency," Mercer said, his voice dropping to a theatrical hush, "does not come from corporate audits or boardroom votes. It comes from the profound courage of individuals who refuse to hide the truth, even when it breaks their own hearts. Tonight, we have someone here who embodies that tragic, beautiful courage." My blood ran entirely cold. I knew exactly what he was about to do. He was not just going to execute my father, he was going to force me to pull the lever. "Violet Garcia," Mercer called out, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Would you please join me on stage?" A collective gasp rippled through the hundreds of guests. The spotlight violently swung away from the podium and pinned me to my chair. I was blinded by the glare, my heart hammering a frantic, agonizing rhythm against my ribcage. This was not part of the carefully constructed counterattack we had planned at the safe house. Mercer was weaponizing my public credibility to deliver the final, lethal blow to Daniel's reputation. If the heartbroken, honest daughter condemned him in front of the entire financial press, there would be absolutely no coming back. I slowly stood up. The heavy fabric of my gown felt like lead armor. I looked desperately toward the back of the ballroom, scanning the shadows near the service doors. My father was standing there, his hands resting in his pockets. He did not step forward. He did not shout for Mercer to stop. He just stood motionless, his expression entirely unreadable, making the entire room believe he had finally run out of moves and accepted his public execution. Panic clawed at my throat. Where was Simon? Where was Tessa? They were supposed to have infiltrated the audiovisual control room 20 minutes ago. The digital counterstrike was supposed to be ready. But the side screens were still playing the silent affair, and the ballroom doors remained tightly shut. Everything felt as though it were violently slipping off the rails, plummeting into the abyss Mercer had dug for us. I walked down the aisle, hundreds of pairs of eyes tracking my every agonizing step. I reached the carpeted stairs leading up to the stage. My hands were trembling, but I forced my fingers to tightly grip the small silk clutch containing my encrypted hard drive. I stepped up to the podium. Mercer stepped aside, offering me the space with a sickening, gracious bow. He reached out and gently adjusted the microphone to my height. "Violet," Mercer said softly, though the microphone caught every syllable and broadcast it to the silent room. "We all know you were the one who originally discovered the breach of trust. The board has prepared a statement for you to read, validating the resolution. We just need you to play the original, unedited footage you recorded. We need you to show this room the absolute truth, so we can finally close this dark chapter and move forward." He pointed to the small digital terminal connected to the main projection system. He was demanding that I use my own hands, my own evidence, to bury my father alive in front of the people who mattered most. I stood alone at the precipice. I looked down at the sea of expectant faces, at my mother sitting like a stone statue, at Nolan watching me with a smug, victorious gleam in his eyes, and finally, at the digital terminal waiting for my command. I pulled the small metal drive from my purse. The entire room held its collective breath, absolutely certain they were about to witness a daughter destroy her own father. I gripped the edges of the podium, staring out into the blinding light, hovering right on the jagged edge of the cliff before the final fall. I pushed the drive into the terminal port. The massive screens flanking the stage flickered, and the silent loop of the restaurant footage vanished, replaced by my own raw, unedited video. I leaned into the microphone. My voice did not shake. 2 weeks ago, I sat in the shadows of a dining room and recorded this. I told the crowd of 500 silent guests. I believed I was watching my father, a man I respected my entire life, tear our family apart with a single, unforgivable touch. I thought I was witnessing the end of an era. I let the video play for exactly 15 seconds. I let them see the intimacy they had been gossiping about all evening. Then, I hit the pause button. The image froze on the massive screens. "But data is entirely dependent on the context," I continued, my voice ringing with cold authority. "When you look closer, the narrative fractures." I engaged the magnification tool on the terminal. The screen zoomed in on Tessa's face. "Look at her eyes," I commanded the room. "She is not gazing at a lover. She is frantically scanning the emergency exit doors. She is terrified." I shifted the frame to the table. "Look at the object my father placed on the linen. It is not a velvet jewelry box. It is a hollowed-out signet ring, designed to conceal a micro-memory card, and the envelope she traded for it does not contain love letters. It contains the encrypted master ledgers of a massive corporate embezzlement scheme. A low murmur began to roll through the ballroom, a wave of confusion and dawning shock. Mercer took a step toward the podium, his face flushing dark red, but I held up my hand, stopping him dead in his tracks. "And finally," I said, pushing the digital magnification to its absolute limit, focusing on the ornate mirror in the background of the video. "If you look at the reflection near the bar, you will see the man who coordinated the anonymous leak of this footage to the press. You will see my fiancé, Nolan Bishop, filming the exact same scene." The murmur erupted into a chaotic clamor. Nolan stood up from table number 4, his perfectly tailored mask completely dissolving into sheer panic. I did not give them a single second to recover. I hit the next button on the terminal. The restaurant video vanished, replaced by the stark, high-definition footage of the underground parking garage. Nolan and Owen Mercer stood in the concrete shadows. Then, the audio file I had captured from Nolan's study blared through the massive concert speakers. "The paperwork is signed." Nolan's recorded voice echoed off the gold leaf ceiling. She was practically shaking when she handed it over. "She is completely isolated. Once the board executes Daniel's removal on Friday, and she is my legal wife, the Garcia voting bloc falls directly into our hands. We will have unquestioned majority control." The ballroom descended into absolute pandemonium. Flashbulbs from the financial press began to fire in a blinding strobe effect. Board members were shouting. Mercer lunged toward the stage steps, desperate to cut the power to the screens, shouting that the files were fabricated, a desperate lie invented by a disgraced family. He never made it to the stage. The heavy oak service doors at the back of the ballroom slammed open. The crowd parted instinctively. Walking down the center aisle, looking incredibly alive, was Simon Holloway. The sudden appearance of a man who had been legally dead for 14 months hit the room like a physical shockwave. The shouting abruptly ceased, replaced by a suffocating, horrified silence. Tessa walked right beside him, her head held high, clutching a heavy leather briefcase. "It is not a fabrication. Owen!" Simon called out, his voice cutting through the silence like a gunshot. "You ordered my death 14 months ago to bury the medical logistics fraud. You routed millions of dollars through the Vanguard Trust. My wife transferred the proof to Daniel at that restaurant because it was the only blind spot in your surveillance network." Mercer stumbled backward, his eyes darting wildly around the room. He looked at the senior board members, his hands raised in desperate supplication. "This is a hostile takeover," Mercer stammered, his voice cracking. "Daniel has lost his mind. He has no authority here. The board has the votes. We have the controlling proxy." "No, Owen," a sharp, aristocratic voice rang out from the front row. "You have absolutely nothing." My mother, Elena Garcia, stood up. She did not raise her voice, but her tone commanded absolute obedience. She pulled a thick, bound legal folio from her evening bag and dropped it onto the table in front of the board chairman. "For the past 3 years, I have systematically liquidated every personal asset I own," my mother stated, her eyes locked onto Mercer with terrifying satisfaction. "I mortgaged my properties and my businesses to anonymously purchase fragmented voting shares. As of this morning, combined with Daniel's founding stake, the Garcia family legally controls 51% of Cobalt Meridian Logistics. The board resolution you hold in your hand is entirely worthless. You are fired." Mercer collapsed into an empty chair, the color draining completely from his face. The empire he had murdered and manipulated to steal had just evaporated into thin air. I stepped down from the podium and walked slowly toward table number 4. Nolan was frozen, his chest heaving, trapped between the stage and the approaching security personnel. I stopped right in front of him. I reached out, took his trembling left hand, and looked him dead in the eyes. I slid the heavy diamond engagement ring off my finger. I pressed the cold stone into his palm and closed his fingers over it. "The most dangerous person in this story was never the father I misunderstood," I told him, my voice loud enough for the surrounding press to hear every single word. It was the man who slept next to me every night, holding my hand, just to learn exactly how to rob my family from the inside. The heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance swung open. The internal corporate counsel, flanked by federal agents from the Front Range Financial Integrity Unit, marched into the ballroom. They moved straight for Mercer and Nolan. There was no struggle. There was only the inevitable, crushing weight of the trap snapping entirely shut. The gala dissolved into chaos as the authorities secured the documents. But the center of the room grew strangely quiet. I walked away from Nolan and moved toward the back of the hall. My father and my mother were standing together near the grand staircase. I walked up to them. We did not fall into a dramatic, tearful embrace. The damage we had inflicted upon each other over the past year was too severe for a simple, cinematic hug. We stood in a triangle amidst the glittering wreckage of the high society event. 3 people who had survived a war by the skin of our teeth. We looked at each other, acknowledging the brutal truth. My father had been wrong to build a wall of silence. My mother had been wrong to fight her financial war entirely alone. And I had been horribly wrong to let my impulsive anger turn me into a weapon against my own blood. We had all hidden things. We had all made catastrophic mistakes. But standing there, breathing the same air, we knew this family had only survived because, in the final hour, I chose to look past the agonizing surface and dig for the absolute truth. I thought I had filmed the definitive evidence of an unforgivable affair. It turned out I had captured the opening sequence of a massive counterattack that unmasked the men who planned to steal my entire family. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. Where in the world are you tuning in from right now? I would love to know, so please leave a comment below and share your thoughts on Violet's journey. If you enjoyed this, do not forget to subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by so many more people.